In this chapter, we're going to be talking about decision making. We want our decision making to be more than just flipping a coin. In this chapter, we'll look at rational decision making as well as the behavioral elements that can get in the way of good decisions. We'll also look at individual versus group decision making. Decision making is the act of choosing one alternative from many. We can see the process starts with recognizing and defining the decision situation. Noting that it's not always a problem that we have to make a decision on. Sometimes it's about an opportunity. We need to identify different alternatives, choose the best one, and then put it into practice. Effective decisions optimize some set of factors, such as sales or profits, or anything else we're trying to accomplish. Decision making is important with all the functions of management. With the planning function, we need to decide on our goals and how to achieve them. With organizing, we need to decide how to structure our business, who reports to who, how to departmentalize. With leading, we have to make decisions on how we engage our employees and motivate them. And lastly, with controlling, we have to make decisions on how we monitor goal achievement and/or control costs. We can categorize decisions as either programmed or non-programmed. Programmed decisions are fairly structured and they recur regularly. You make programmed decisions all the time. This morning when you woke up and the alarm went off, you had to make a decision. Do I hit the snooze button or do I get up and start my day? We don't put a lot of time and energy and thought into these decisions. And if we did put time and thought into them, we did it once and then they become more routine. Such as buying gas. We don't go through a long analysis every morning to figure out where we're going to stop and buy gas. Or even purchasing supplies for the office or replenishing inventory. We know when it hits a certain level, we order more. Non-programmed decisions, on the other hand, are pretty unstructured. We don't do them that often, and we have to put more time and analysis into making those decisions. For instance, if we need to purchase new laptops for our sales force, we have to consider all the factors that go into making this decision. Perhaps it's been 3 or 4 years since we made this type of purchase. We have to think about what are the needs of our sales force now? How have they changed? Figure out what the important factors to consider are. Of course, costs and price are important, but given the fact that it's for our sales force, we also have to think about the functionality, the weight, since they'll be carrying them around, how much memory it has, and how it's going to be used. This will take more analysis, and with non-programmed decisions, they tend to be larger in terms of the costs involved, as well as the impact it has on the organization. For instance, with our laptop example, we might be spending a lot of money to replace all the laptops for our sales force. And if they don't work effectively for those salespeople, we could see a loss in productivity, a loss in sales, and other problems pop up. So just as we have different types of decisions, we have different conditions under which we make those decisions. So we see here we have 3 different conditions to consider: certainty, risk, and uncertainty. As you'll see, the level of ambiguity associated with each of these decision-making conditions influences the chances of us making a bad decision. So when the level of ambiguity is low, our chances of making a bad decision are also low. It makes sense. So in conditions of certainty, we know with reasonable certainty what the alternatives are and what conditions are associated with each of those alternatives. For instance, if we had extra money laying around and we wanted to invest it, we wanted to make sure we didn't lose any of it until we needed it. We could go to the bank. We know that certain accounts of the bank are FDIC insured, so we know we won't lose money if the bank goes under, and they guarantee a certain level of interest, like a certificate of deposit or a savings account. We know we're not going to lose money. We know exactly what that money is going to earn over the time frame it's in there. That's a condition of certainty. In the book, they talk about a business having to buy an airplane, a jet. Only 2 companies make those jets, so they know the 2 alternatives they have. They can research both of those companies and make a decision and know with certainty what it's going to cost, when it's going to be delivered, and all the factors involved. Under conditions of risk, we might know the availability of different alternatives and their potential payoffs and costs, but there are risks involved. So we don't know with certainty on certain things. So, for example, when we talk about negotiations, when you are negotiating a labor contract, you go into this negotiation coming up with a proposal based on what is going on in the environment, what you know what inflation rates are, you know what the projected economic environment is, and you put together a proposal. As you negotiate and go back and forth, you have some idea of what the other side, what the reaction might be to certain proposals. And you make these calculated judgments based on those risks. If the one side says this is our final offer, is it really their final offer? You've been in these negotiations before. What will happen next? So you know, given one condition, one alternative, if you were to call their bluff, well, 2 things could happen. Either it stops the negotiations right there, perhaps the one side decides to strike, or perhaps the other side says we're at impasse and we have to go into the next stage, like we're out of negotiations now. Or does it prompt them to come up with a different counter and the negotiations continue going on? Okay, so based on experience, based on probabilities of what the different alternatives are, you make those decisions. Now with uncertainty, it's different. You do not know all the alternatives out there, or the risks associated with each, or the consequences of each alternative. And a lot of big decisions with companies are made under those conditions of uncertainty, especially if they're doing something that's never been done before, right? We don't have history to go upon to look at probabilities. And certainly during a crisis like the coronavirus outbreak, decisions are being made under these conditions of uncertainty. You don't know how bad it'll be, what the impact on the economy will be. So that's a perfect example of decision making under uncertainty. Now I want to compare and contrast rational decision making versus the behavioral perspectives. The rational model of decision making, considered the classic model, assumes that managers are logical and rational and that their decisions will be in the best interest of the organization. The behavioral approach, also called the administrative model, argues that decision makers have incomplete information, they're constrained by bounded rationality, and they tend to satisfice when making decisions. So what we're going to do as we move forward in this chapter is we will look at rational decision making and that process, but then we're going to look at and define some of these terms of the behavioral model. We'll learn about bounded rationality, what satisficing is, and how these behavioral approaches can affect our decision making. So now let's look at the decision making process with an example. So in this example, as we saw in the beginning of the PowerPoints, first thing we have to do when we're making decisions is recognize that we have a decision to make and define the decision situation. So in this example, we have a plant manager that sees that employee turnover has increased by 5%. Just so we're clear, turnover is when we have employees leave and we need to rehire. So why is turnover a problem? Well, it's expensive. Anytime we have to hire someone and train them for a job, it costs money. It costs money in terms of time spent on it, as well as actual money being put out for listing the position and all the other things involved with it. So when we see that turnover has increased, we are going to see that that has an increase in our costs and a reduction in our productivity. So the next step is identifying alternatives. So we don't evaluate them until we get them all listed, because if we start evaluating the alternatives as we come up with them, we might stunt our ability to come up with a variety of alternatives. So both the obvious and the creative alternatives should be put together. The more alternatives you come up with, the better. Not all of them are going to be ideal, obviously, but when we come up with several alternatives, sometimes an alternative that is mentioned leads someone else to think of something, a whole different path of alternatives. So we don't want to stunt any brainstorming at this stage. So the plant manager comes up with a few options here. Well, we can increase wages, we could increase benefits, or we could change our hiring standards. So when we talk about hiring standards, that would be, say we require a certain degree or a certain number of years of experience, or we don't require anything for this position, and that might be why we have a problem. So if we're requiring a certain degree for someone to have this job, and the people with those credentials are bored in this job because that's really the inappropriate criteria for this job, they might leave. And on the flip side, if we don't have enough conditions for this employment and someone is hired that is insufficiently prepared for this job, they might be over their head and they also decide to leave. So that's what we mean about hiring standards. So now, once we've identified these alternatives, now we need to evaluate them. So we're going to look at how feasible they are, what consequence will we see with those. So increasing benefits might not be feasible because it's too expensive. Increasing wages and changing the hiring standards may satisfy all the conditions we're worried about. So now we need to make a decision and select which one is best. Again, you think about all the situational factors. So this might be happening this year, this decision, and maybe this was a problem 5 years ago. We can't make the same exact decision we might have made 5 years ago because the situational factors may have changed. So the decision of changing the hiring standards might make too long to actually see a change quickly, so they decide to implement just an increase in wages. So you implement this, making sure you have the authority to put into effect the change you want to do, and we see how it goes. The last part of every process in management is always following up and seeing how this played out. Was it a good decision? Did we get what we needed out of it, or do we need to revisit it? So the plant manager notes that 6 months into the future, he checks it and turnover has dropped to its previous level. So we see that this was the right decision given this situation. If we didn't see the results we wanted, we would have to recognize that we still have a problem and start this process again and try something else. This is a rational approach to decision making. It has a process we can follow, and if more decisions were made following this process, we'd probably have better decisions. But we need to recognize that decisions are not always made with rationality and logic. The behavioral aspects of decision making often come into play. That's not to say that it's always a bad thing. Now, some of these are things you want to avoid, but not all of them are bad, and we'll go through each one of them. Bounded rationality is probably the most difficult for students to understand. As defined in the book, decision makers are limited by their values, unconscious reflexes, skills, and habits. I think the best way to understand this one is to give you an example. So let's just back it up a little and do some definitions here. What does rational mean? It means it's based on facts or reason and not on emotions or feelings, and being able to think or reason about things clearly. So bounded rationality means that we're limited because of our emotions, because of our habits, our skills, our experiences. So once we understand what it means to be rational, we can start to understand bounded rationality and why it falls on the behavioral side of decision making. So bounded rationality means we're bounded or limited by the information we have. Since each of us has different life experiences and knowledge, we are each limited differently in our decision making. If we are rational, we consider all options, weigh them, and choose the one that is optimal. However, I may not know all the options, or realize how one is better or worse than another, or I may make decisions based on my emotions. Let me give you a personal example. When I was in college, I wrecked my beloved car. I didn't have any money or anyone in my family that was knowledgeable about cars, so I ended up financing a brand new 1987 Hyundai Excel. It was the cheapest new car I could find. The newness wore off quickly, and soon after, the car was burning oil and any love I had for it was long gone. It was the worst car I ever had. When I was finally able to replace it, I swore I would never own another Hyundai. Fast forward to 2013. My minivan was on its last legs and I needed a car. I checked out VW because we already owned one, and I did a test drive. Then I started doing online research. I searched dependable cars and reliable cars, and each time Hyundai came up. Ugh! I wouldn't even consider a Hyundai. This is an example of bounded rationality. Even though this may be the most logical purchase, I wouldn't consider it because of my past experience. Now to continue the story. Since I teach this, and I recognize this as bounded rationality, I actually investigated the brand, compared prices, and test drove several models. I ended up buying a 2013 Hyundai Sonata. As it turns out, it was the cheapest new car I found. Except this time, it was also rated as the most dependable and reliable with the best warranty. It's important to recognize when we're being influenced by bounded rationality and hopefully not succumb to it. I hope this helps your understanding of bounded rationality. And looking back 6 years, 7 years now from buying that car, it probably was one of the best purchases I made. And I'm very glad I didn't spend more money on a car, especially having my children driving it whenever their cars broke down. Now let's look at satisficing. This is the tendency to search for alternatives only until one is found that meets some minimum standard of sufficiency to resolve the problem. It's not about satisfying everyone. Satisficing is a cross between satisfy and sacrifice. The idea behind this term is that you are sacrificing the optimal choice, which might be elusive, for a choice that is satisfactory in some way. It is a decision-making shortcut. So instead of searching exhaustively for the optimal decision, you decide on some minimum standard that needs to be met, and your decision is based on that. Moving on to coalitions. Coalitions can be a positive or a negative political force in decision-making, which consists of an informal alliance of individuals or groups formed to achieve a goal. So, when we talk about a political force, we're not really talking about politics in terms of Republicans and Democrats. We're talking about getting people on board with a certain approach. So if I wanted to introduce something to the membership as union president, I might talk to different groups of people and make sure I have their support so that when it's introduced, I have a coalition of people supporting what I want to do. Now, it can be positive if what I'm trying to do is a good thing, or it can also be negative if this political force is going against what might be in the best interests of an organization. Moving on to intuition. Intuition also impacts decision-making. However, although this falls under the behavioral aspect, it isn't always bad. Intuition is a hunch or a gut feeling, but it isn't necessarily without merit. Usually, our gut feeling is based on our experiences. For instance, the producers of VH1 were in Ozzy Osbourne's home for an interview, and the producer knew that having cameras in the Osbourne household would make for a popular reality TV show. So without going through the normal process of show development, the show was put on the air. This decision was made using intuition, but it was based on the producer's experience, and she was right. Now let's move on to escalation of commitment, which is when a decision maker stays with a decision even when it appears to be wrong. So let's look at an example. If you're responsible for hiring an employee, and that employee doesn't appear to be working out, but you don't want to admit that you made a bad decision in this hire, you may put this employee in for more training, switch their department that they're in, all different types of approaches, instead of just admitting it might have been a bad hire. So instead of letting someone go that isn't working out, you invest more time and money and further commit to your original decision instead of admitting that it might have been the wrong decision. Lastly, let's look at risk propensity. Each of us has a different threshold for risk, and we need to recognize that when we're making decisions. It's important to recognize the level of risk you're comfortable with and the types of decisions you're making so that your risk propensity aligns properly with the types of decisions you're making and also aligns with the culture of the organization you're working within. Now let's shift to looking at group and team decision making in organizations. Here we see 3 different types of groups. Interacting groups or teams consist of an existing group or a newly formed team interacting and then making a decision. This is a typical team or group as we would use it in class. A Delphi group develops a consensus of expert opinion from a panel of experts who individually contribute through some sort of moderator. Okay, not as common as the interacting group. And then nominal groups. These groups generate ideas through the individual contributions of alternatives that are narrowed down to reach a decision. So there are advantages and disadvantages with using group decision making as opposed to individual decision making. The advantages of group decision making are pretty clear. If we have more people involved in a decision, we have more information coming in, more knowledge at our disposal, and that should help us generate more alternatives. When more people are involved, we tend to have better communication and acceptance of the final decision, and generally, we'll get better decisions made when people that are impacted by the decision are actually involved in the decision making. Now, there are disadvantages to group decision making. The process takes longer, right? If one person is making a decision, it can be made quickly. When you have to get input from several people, it's going to drag the process out. So anytime something takes longer, it costs more. Compromise decisions can result when we have group decision making going on. Now, compromise sounds like a positive thing, and it can be. But sometimes we compromise because we're sick of discussing something, when if we worked a little longer and got more creative with something, we might not have to compromise because we could come up with a creative solution that didn't require a compromise. As we've seen when you work in groups, sometimes you have a person in a group that can dominate the group. And when that happens, you might not get the best decision because people are allowing this person to dominate the group, so their opinions become louder and kind of keep other options from being expressed. And then lastly, groupthink may occur. Groupthink is not a good thing. Groupthink is when the group gets along really well, so well that no one wants to hurt anybody else's feelings, and you might all decide on something even though it's not the best idea. So we have to understand how to manage groups during this decision-making process. And we can promote effectiveness by making sure the people in the groups are aware of the pros and cons of using a group or team to make a decision. We need to set deadlines for when decisions need to be made. Otherwise, even with any goal we set, it might not happen. We want to avoid the dominance problems by managing who's in our groups. So if we know we have strong personalities, we might want to make sure we have other strong personalities to offset that one strong personality. Having each group member critically evaluate all alternatives. So one of the things I like to tell people to do is, just start what you're going to say with, I'm just playing devil's advocate here, and question different alternatives and decisions. As a manager asking for a group to make a decision, one of the things you might want to do is not let your position be known too early. Because if you say, I'd like to do, XYZ, but I want you all to look into what we should do. Well, you've now planted the seed. They know that you want XYZ, so chances are that's what you're going to get. I always like to give the example of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? You get the lifeline of polling the audience. And I always am shocked when the person goes through their whole thought process and says, well, I know it can't be A because of this. I don't think it can be B because of this. So I'm really tossed up between C and D. But I really think it's C. And then when they poll the audience, guess what? Which one comes up? C. Whether it's right or wrong. Because they think, well, if he thinks it's C, yeah, it's probably C. So you don't want to let your position known too early, especially if you want an objective decision by the group. And then always, with any process, hold a follow-up meeting to recheck the decision and get feedback.